Today, I'm joined by Matthew Southcombe, and we're going to be talking about the culture issue at the WRU. Firstly, Matt, can you just introduce when you first got wind of the scandal?
So obviously, it wasn't our story. The BBC investigates team broke the news. So like everybody else, really, that's when I sort of first came across it. It wasn't something that had really been doing the rounds, so it did land as a bit of a surprise to everybody, really, who were outside that BBC Wales Investigates team. So yeah, I was pretty much like everybody else, and some of my other colleagues. Really, we found out when the BBC published their stories.
What was the first piece of content that you personally published on the issue?
I was just trying to jog my memory of that. I think the following day, the Welsh Rugby Union put up Steve Phillips, who was the CEO at the time, to face questions on the allegations. And so we're talking, I think, a good 24 hours on from the BBC's programme going to air. So I'd had the day to do my own sort of fact checking, make calls, try and get some information around the allegations, how they were being received by the union, and things like that. And then, as I say, when the WRU put Steve Phillips up to face questions, that gave us enough then to sort of run our package, and I did a live around that package as well.
Talk about that, how it affected the union. Is that something you always have to think about? Because obviously, sort of access to get access to the union, you've got to sort of be, you know, you can't run them up the wrong ways in a certain way. Is that something you have to think about?
Not really in that regard. I think you have a responsibility to a lot of people in a scenario like this. You have a responsibility, certainly to the woman who was making the allegations. Um, it's a bit of a thin line to tread, really, because you have to obviously take her allegations extremely seriously, because of the nature of them. But you also have to be aware as well of the possibility that, however slim that chance is, they might not be true. If you repeat an allegation if you present an allegation as fact, and that it then comes to light that it's not quite the truth, you could find yourself in a lot of hot water there. So it's a bit of a difficult one. You have to first and foremost take her allegations extremely seriously, but you have to speak to the Welsh Rugby Union to get their side of the story. You have to give them a chance to respond, which is what happened the day after. So in that immediate 24 hours, you've got a lot of things to consider. As I say, the first instinct is to take the allegations at face value and, as I say, treat them with the seriousness they deserve. But you also have to consider the remote chance that, the reality might be slightly different to how it's being presented from one side. So it's always important to get both sides of that story. In terms of the access to the Welsh Rugby Union, that doesn't really factor in. You can't be influenced by the potential of losing access. And I think in any case, in this example, the chances of that happening are quite slim because it would be a public relations disaster for the Welsh Rugby Union if they were to remove the access of a journalist who reported on a story like this, perhaps in a way that they didn't think was favourable to them. They're not really in a position to do that at that time. But I think the more you're in this role, and the more you deal with an organisation like the Welsh Rugby Union, you kind of you realise that you just have to call it how it is, and they will have to put up with that as long as you're fair. As long as you're fair.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have to think about media law when you were obviously publishing the piece? Just a lot of like obviously potential defamation in there. Is
Hmm.
that something you have to think about when you were publishing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the first thing you think about. I kind of touched on it in the last answer. At the moment, words matter in this scenario big time. I think they would probably, if I was reporting on it now, 2 years on, you would still have to call them allegations. Because I think from memory, the report that eventually came out in the November of that year still didn't really directly relate to the original claims. It talked about the culture as a whole, but it never spoke about individual cases. So I don't know that anybody has ever, certainly nobody has ever been identified as taking responsibility for these allegations. I don't recall there being an admission of guilt from the WRU as it pertains to these specific allegations that came out originally. People left the union around that time, but nobody was identified as somebody as being responsible for these specific allegations, and that's important. Steve Phillips, who was the CEO at the time, left because he was also the finance director at the time that these allegations took place. So he
Yeah.
was in a position of seniority at the union when this when these allegations were happening at the time. So he left because he felt like his position was untenable. I guess I don't know whether he left on his own accord or whether he was forced out. But in terms of the legal side of things, it's very important not to present the allegations as fact. Um, so when I look back at some of my reporting at the time, you'll notice that every time we spoke about the story, it was always allegations because I don't have the first-hand evidence, of what was being claimed. I haven't seen any hard evidence of this. Essentially, what you had was one version of a story and the WRU's version of a story. So when you haven't seen the evidence, it has to just be allegations. And quite quickly, when the WRU started addressing them, you begin to feel like you're on safer ground because they're clearly acknowledging this. So then things relax a little bit, but certainly initially, and probably to this day, you've got to really, unless you've seen the evidence, it has to just be spoken about as an allegation, certainly not as a fact.
Yeah. Is there anything you think you would have done differently in terms of your reporting on it? Because obviously, obviously they were great articles. I read both of them, but is there anything you think you would have done differently looking back on it?
Um, Not really. As I say, I'd just been rewatching the coverage at the time. I don't think so. I think when Steve Phillips was made available the following day, he had to be held accountable, and I felt like I was able to do that. I directly asked him if his job was tenable, if he felt anyone should lose their jobs over this, and he denied that. He said he didn't think anybody should. Obviously, as we now know, people did. But I think, a lot was going on within a short space of time in the build up to a Six Nations when the players would then go on to strike. So there was a lot of, or threaten to strike. So there was a lot going on in the background anyway, in Welsh rugby. But I think when I reflect on how we covered that story, I don't think we have any regrets really.
No, as you say there, obviously the players obviously went threatened to go on strike, and obviously the Six Nations was really poor. Uh, do you struggle with stuff like obviously reporting on stuff like that that affects the reputation of the WRU that would potentially affect on pitch matters, sort of?
No, not necessarily. One thing that I always think of, I used to think, particularly in my newspaper days when you used to have to give opinions about players' performances, it can be difficult. But I once heard a quote from a reporter in America, a guy called Stephen A. Smith. You may be familiar with him. He's a bit
Yeah, yeah.
eccentric, but he's quite. I used to quite enjoy watching him, and he said players write their own scripts. So, if a player plays poorly, it's not my fault he or she played poorly. I can only report on that. And if an organization behaves poorly or makes mistakes that are, pretty serious mistakes and oversights and not addressing problems that should have been addressed. And we now know from the report that the culture at the WRU was pretty appalling from the other things that came out in that report. So again, my approach to that is that as a reporter, it's not my problem really that the union has behaved in this way. They've created the problem for themselves. And, the WRU is a private company, but it does have some public money going towards it, but not an awful lot. So it's not like you're holding a public, body to account. They're a private company,
Yeah.
but they are one of the most, if not the most important private company in the country. They take our nation to the world. They are, if you live on the other side of the world and you like sport, the Welsh Rugby Union is probably the face of our country, and it was in complete turmoil at the time. So you have a responsibility to hold them to account.
If you look at obviously Wales now and the WRU, we're obviously still struggling. Do you think there's any sort of chance of a comeback in the next couple of years? Do you think, obviously, since the scandal and even before then, we've been really struggling? Do you think there's a possibility we could see a turnaround in the near future,
In terms of on the field or off?
on and off, really?
Um, I think the two are separate. The on-field issues we're seeing now are, in my opinion, to do with the fact that our pathway systems and academies were pretty much neglected when, Warren Gatland had that golden decade really and a golden generation of players. And so I think that's one issue. The Welsh Rugby Union as a business and a company still turn over an awful lot of money, and the stadium still fills out. I mean, ticket sales for the autumn are a bit sketchy, but they still make an awful lot of money as a business. I think there is still a long way to go. You can see the current problems at the moment with the potential of losing regions and a lot of players going out of jobs, and it's difficult. Interestingly, as you came to me, I did think it's probably worth checking back in to see how they're doing with regards to the review that happened after this sexism scandal, because they vowed to implement every recommendation in that report. Some of them were short, medium, and long term, but we're what, where are we? 2.5 years on now. Time moves very quickly. I think it's probably worth checking in to see just how far they've got there. But I mean, we've been trying to find, in terms of the Welsh Rugby Union and governance of Welsh Rugby, been trying to find an agreeable path forward for 20, 25 years since the regions were formed. So it just seems like a perpetual crisis essentially, which keeps us busy, but is no good for the health of Welsh rugby.
It'd be certainly something to look at if you think of the independent review and how nothing's, well, it looks like nothing's really changed. But just as a final question, what advice would you give to journalists who maybe would cover a similar story in the future? Is there anything you'd say to them on how to look at it and how to publish it?
Um, I would just I would just say that more than ever with stories like this, you have to be extremely careful with what you say and how you word things. When I was working in newspapers with a story like this, it would go through probably two or three sets of eyes before it was published. These days, when I stand in front of a camera and we're live, there's no second chance. If you say the wrong thing or if you forget to say that these are allegations, if you try and present what is being claimed as a fact, then you could end up in real trouble. So I think words, as I said before, words really do matter. You need to take extra care. Seek the advice of your legal department if you need to. You know, it is there's an old school phrase in journalism I've heard a lot that it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. But in this instance, you are you are in seriously thin ice if you adopt that approach. I think you need to consider, as I said before, you need to get both sides of the story. You need to speak to the other party and give them a right of reply and an opportunity to respond to the claims. And you just need to choose your words extremely carefully.
But I think that's some brilliant advice there, and great way to end it. Thanks very much for your time, Matt.
No problem.